of the people who would be voting, should we need to vote today? Because we're kind of like the technical working group. It's not necessarily a formal set of voting members. If you could do that while I'm fiddling.
Yes, thank you. I believe Doreen will be helping us with the roll call.
Correct. And so far, Anne, you're the only member that is on that I see.
Okay. What I'm going to do a little bit of business then while we wait for the other members. Our county manager, Mike Callaghy, and the team that has been working on COVID had a special meeting. It is still ongoing right now. I just left that meeting, and I know that Councilman, former Mayor Al Royce from Hillsborough was at that meeting. It's supposed to go for an hour, but we haven't met together as a group of elected officials in about 4 months. And with the Omicron virus, it was a critical update. So I'm sure we will get there on that. I would also like to say, because a number of people got in touch with me via email that they wanted to know if they would be able to comment at this meeting, given that the roundtable had gone through some modifications. And what I would like to do is ensure that if any public member has a comment for items on the agenda, to please go ahead and raise your hand at that time, and we will make time for you. And that would bring me to the first item on the agenda, which is for public comment for items not on the agenda. So Angela and Darlene, if we could check with the attendees, I see one hand up. For items not on the agenda, but you will have time to speak on items that are specific, even in a broad sense, because I think this group is much more like the technical working group. We do need to dive into the details, and sometimes they can seem slightly off issue. Go ahead, Mr. Schell.
Thank you, Chair Schneider. Really quick, I would like to share the instructions. Just I'm sure we're all seasoned
Certainly.
here in participating in Zoom meetings, but just if we have anybody that is new, I will quickly like to give instructions. And then before I do that, I would just like to point out that we do have Jean Rendell from HMMH with us, as well as SFO Aircraft Noise Office staff, Mr. Bert Ganong. And we also have county staff, Lisa Sosa and Janice Lujan, supporting our meeting today.
And the really good news, Angela, is we have Mayor or Councilman Al Royce in the attendees list, and we also have Linda Wolin. We would need to move both of them over to the panelist list.
Yes, let me do that really quick. 1 second before
Thank you.
We move on to ensure.
And I guess while she is doing that, first, welcome everyone to our first ground-based noise meeting of 2022, our meeting of January 13th, 2022. I hope everyone is safe and healthy and had a nice break over the holidays. Okay, with that, I think we've moved over our panelists, and Mr. Schell, if we can unmute him and let him go.
Yes, thank you so much. And just as a reminder, if you would like to indicate your desire to speak and you are calling by phone, you may press *9. So Mr. Schell, please accept this request to unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
I think you're still muted, Mr. Schell.
All right, I'm ready.
There you go.
Mark Schell, Palo Alto. Not to take up too much time, but one of the things that keeps coming up is how the community can report departure noise. Frankly, it would be rather straightforward to modify Adam Worrell's stop-jet noise reporting app to do this, including addressing the issues of dual departures. Conversely, I don't think it's technically possible for the EnviroSuite app to do this, to support departures in any really useful way. I do think community departure noise reporting should be added to the work plan of this subcommittee, and that at least with Adam's application, simple and meaningful reporting is something that could be delivered to the near airport community. Thank you.
Excellent suggestion, community noise report. And I didn't capture everything you said. If you would like to pop me an email with your suggestions. I'm not sure, I think we do have an agenda item that will allow us to talk about the work plan, so we can bring it back at that time. If there are no other comments for items not on today's agenda, I'm going to move back over to the panelist. And now we have a consent calendar item. This is the resolution that will allow us to continue to meet in a Zoom or in a virtual area. And I believe I need a motion and a second. This is the only item on consent calendar.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Royce. Is there a second out there? If not, to move it along, I'll second it.
Okay.
And Angela, this is that roll call question. If everybody could just say aye. I know there's three of us. I think Linda's here for Supervisor Pine. So I'm never quite sure voting, but I think this is approved. Let's move on to the meat of our meeting, which is going back to the ground-based noise spectral analysis report that was conducted by HMMH and introduced to this committee in January of last year. And then we had a brief discussion because we had just gotten the report, a brief discussion in our July meeting in terms of what to send to the FAA, but we really haven't dived into it. And I am not exactly sure. We're missing Kathleen. For all the newcomers or people here, our staff person, Michelle Rodriguez, has moved on. We miss her greatly. She kept us very well organized. I wish her the best in her future. But so whoever's going to tell us a little bit about the GBN report and the next steps based from that report, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ann. This is Gene Reindell with HMMH. I will go ahead and bring up, give me just a minute to share my screen.
And really quick, as you're settling in, Jean, I would also like to know and welcome Ms. Kathleen Wentworth is with us today. Welcome, Kathleen.
Okay, so this presentation is essentially the same or nearly the same as was presented almost exactly a year ago today. I know it's probably a good refresher to just kind of remind ourselves what it was, why we did it, and what the results were. So that's really the purpose of this, so that we can then determine, next steps. And as Ann mentioned earlier, think about putting together potentially a work plan or a work program for this subcommittee. And I think this is a good place to have a refresher on the ground-based noise study that was completed by HMMH. So just a brief outline, we'll talk about the what was the ground-based noise, how we modeled it, and then the summary of results, and then just briefly on next steps. So basically, the goals of the program were to better understand how ground-based noise propagates out into the communities adjacent to San Francisco from aircraft departures, and then to assess the effectiveness of vegetation to potentially reduce ground-based noise from those departures. And so the noise model inputs, I won't go into this in great detail, but we used a lot of geographic information from GIS systems, digital photography, those sorts of things. We put in the man-made structures into the noise model and looked at a number of receptor locations, completed analysis using 3 aircraft types, and then looked at vegetation that was approximately 50 feet thick and 46 feet tall. And we placed it along the Caltrans right away, which was an opportunity just to place something there, just see what the noise model would result in noise reduction from some of those operations. And so here is basically the condition on the left is no barrier or no vegetation. The one on the right is with vegetation. It's worth looking at these plots that were made, and I know the full report has these in much, they're a little bit larger, a little easier to see, but I really wanted to focus in on, close by how sound propagates out, and that's what you're seeing here is aircraft depart runway 1 left. This is for the A320 aircraft type, and you see it there on the runway at the start of departure roll, and using full power thrust departure, how the noise then propagates out into the community, and then out with the green vegetation line that you see there, kind of the little bit of difference that it makes in how that propagates out. And you can see the differences is really close to the vegetation area. Once you get, like 2 rows of homes or so in, the change is really minor or negligible at that point. So and that's true of most barrier types. You usually get the reduction really close to the barrier, and that's why you either put the barrier close to the source or close to the receiver.
And Jean, sorry if I can interrupt. When I went back over this report last night and then read a couple of others, I had to keep flipping back and forth for what the colors mean. And the yellow, if I remember correctly in this report, is 80 decibels.
I believe that's correct. Yes, I would have to go back and look exactly too. And I'm not focused exactly on what the levels are here, as more about, one of the goals was to see actually how does that sound propagate out, taking into account, the man-made structures that are in between, that and the receiver. But yes, I think you're right with the yellow level being about.
And the reason I bring that up is under the current FAA approved process for noise contours. If you look at the second photograph, the second picture, the only 3 homes in Millbrae that fall within the 65 decibel are right on that corner. And yet the modeling shows entire neighborhoods are in at least the 80 decibel area.
Yeah, and these are also 80 decibels in terms of the actual sound level, not of community noise equivalent level. And so the community noise equivalent level, which are the contours that are prepared and show the areas of high noise exposure from aircraft operations, take into account a full year of operations, and it's an annual average of those operations and the noise levels that are subjected to that. So
which then would bring us to annoyance and whether we human beings average annoyance out over a year on 24/7 calendar. We'll come back to that in terms of next steps. Sorry, keep going.
Okay. So hopefully people understand, and can better then understand the information that's contained in the report. So this is basically kind of showing, what the modeling did and what it kind of showed. Basically, and in summary, reduction of noise levels from vegetation is expected to be on the order of basically a dB or so, and only for places immediately adjacent to the vegetation. So changes of less than 3 dB, as we've said before, are barely perceptible. So, and also the vegetation area must be greater than 30 feet wide to begin to provide noise reduction. So vegetation is only minimally effective. And we will get to that a little bit more in a bit. So San Francisco did provide, the airport, SFO, provided a number of comments, either 6 or 7 comments to the report, and I want to address them here at this time as well. The first comment was that the noise model used for this study is not approved by the FAA. And while that is true, the FAA does accept use of these sorts of models, such as SoundPlan, and we have used SoundPlan to justify barriers to be installed for noise abatement purposes, according to Part 150, because the FAA's model does not currently include the sound propagation algorithms to put in man-made buildings and structures and barriers and things like that. It does not do that. You'll see a little bit later on that they have plans, the FAA have plans to update their model to provide that sort of analysis capability, but it doesn't exist now. So they do allow other noise models such as SoundPlan to assess barriers and to really look at sound propagation and how man-made structures affect it. The second comment was that the Boeing 767 aircraft is not representative of a Boeing 777 aircraft in terms of noise exposure levels. And we do concur with that. And we did put in the actual data from the Boeing 777 as well as the Boeing 767 to show the differences. They're not identical, but they were similar. So we just used 767 as a basis to represent a Boeing 777. You could argue that maybe it wasn't a good representation, but in terms of, again, how the sound propagates out, it's probably not a real bad representation either. And unfortunately, we're just limited by the data that we have available for the sound plan model. We just didn't have the 777 data available. So we used the 767 as a representative of that. The third comment from the airport was that the model default meteorological values are not representative of conditions at SFO. We also concur with that. We didn't modify the meteorological conditions in the sound plan model because, again, we weren't focused on exactly having an exact precise values of noise levels. We are more concerned with how a vegetation might reduce the noise levels and or how the noise propagates out into the community given the man-made structures and that sort of thing. So in terms of the meteorological conditions in the model, it would have had really limited effect on the propagation as opposed to wind, speed, direction, and temperature inversions. So the difference should be pretty minimal, but we do concur that they were not the representative conditions of San Francisco in terms of an annual average meteorological conditions. There was a comment from the airport that figures 17 and 18 should have had the same contours and do not. We can look into this further, but our initial review is that 17 shows conditions with no vegetation and figure 18 shows the same condition with vegetation and should have slightly different results as shown in the figures. We haven't looked at it much more than just that. So if San Francisco still believes that those should be different, then perhaps I'm looking at a version of the report that maybe is different than theirs, or I'm overlooking something and happy to review that with them at a future time. Then the next comment was remove the recommendation to use vegetation for noise mitigation, as the HMH report findings do not support such a recommendation. And generally, we concur with that. We did say that it provides limited benefit, being just about 1 decibel, but I think this committee had discussed that communities may still be interested in trying to find areas that such vegetation could be considered, and that was the reason for still keeping that in there as a recommendation if the communities wanted to try to find ways to implement barriers. The next comment was that vegetative barriers may attract hazardous wildlife, and therefore the airport opposes the use of vegetation barriers near our San Francisco airport. And again, we concur. We don't want to bring in vegetation near the airport that would attract hazardous wildlife such as birds, because we know the issue with birds and the potential for bird strikes to our airport or aircraft operations. So we'd want to be sure and work with the airport, or the communities would want to work with the airport when they may put in such barriers.
I'm sorry, Mr. Rendell. I understand that you, the consultant, may concur with that. But if one were to extrapolate that thought, I guess the city of Millbrae should cut down every tree in Millbrae, because heaven forbid we should have a bird near the airport. So
Okay.
I strongly disagree with a report that concurs with something that's ridiculous.
Well, there are actually
And there are
federal
plenty of studies that show that different vegetation as well as wetland vegetation do not bring in birds that cause a problem. And the airport itself has vegetation, including trees, right at its entry point. So to dictate to local communities something that they themselves do not do is not acceptable.
Well,
Sorry,
and there
keep
are
going.
different.
That's my
No,
opinion, and that will be the opinion of Millbrae. Keep going.
no, we can discuss this a little bit because the FAA actually has guidelines in terms of vegetation, and not all vegetation would attract the wildlife, as you said. So, you know, I do also say here that further research may be required as well. If you know you want to put in some vegetation, make sure that you're applying the federal guidelines and doing so near an airport. So
That
there are
would be
ways to do it.
acceptable.
Right, there are ways to do it. I'm just saying that you know they certainly have to oppose it because of that is a valid reason, but there are ways to research that further.
And I want to clarify one other way that you're presenting this information. You are saying that if the adjacent cities want to do this, what we are talking about here are mitigations that the airport needs to do to mitigate ground-based noise or low-frequency noise in partnership, perhaps with adjacent communities. But this is not something communities have to do when the pollution is created by a large industrial complex. Let's just get it straight here.
Okay. And then the last comment was that barriers at the height required to break the line of sight may violate or would violate FAA regulations on height limitations near airports. And again, there are FAA guidelines and requirements for height restrictions, so you would just have to also comply with those when installing such vegetative barriers. So,
Okay.
and I believe that's all of the comments and how we want to address those. I don't know if this committee wants us to make any modifications to the report to address those comments or not, but leave it to maybe looking at next steps and coming up with the work plan and see if that's required at that point. But according to the work plan for the roundtable, this committee was to complete the study, so that's kind of done, but then also recommend next steps to the roundtable membership for approval, and that's where we want to then look at. I'm suggesting coming up with a work plan for this committee that really does address next steps, and so anyway, that's where we're at this point. So the report has been done, and now the committee is tasked with coming up with the next steps. And
thank you, Mr. Rendell. And sorry if I'm a bit hard on you, but we, the cities, get to have something to say. And I know that Al Royce has his hand up, and I couldn't find your letter, Al, that you sent with additional comments. So please take the floor.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to comment. It's been a while since I looked at the report, and so I appreciate you doing a debrief of it. That's very helpful. Just a couple of comments on your on the summary recommendations. I do agree with Ann that if it reads right now as though vegetation's off the table. And if there is a way to make it work, I think that ought to be implicit in your report rather than we concur, i.e. this is a problem. I would just reword that so that you would say it may be a problem, but it may be addressed through other types of vegetation. Because the city looking at this is going to read that. My first reaction was, well, that's a problem, doesn't work. I'm not sure that's what you say. My more critical comment, though, was on the comment that that vegetation does not yield a precipitable result. Is there a type of vegetation that would? I mean,
so vegetation usually does not provide a lot of perceptible difference. There have been studies done to show that, say you have like a wooded area and you walk through that wooded area, it would need to be dense enough to where, and they actually did a study, it's called the white diaper study, where they carried a white diaper through the woods. And when the two people that were in the woods could no longer see it, which is quite a distance, then you start to get some perceptible reduction from the vegetation that's in that area. So It does take quite a bit. The model showed that you get around a dB very close to the vegetation, and if it's on the order of 50 feet thick. So it's not really an effective way of reducing noise, which is what the report essentially states there. But because there was some reduction, maybe it's the committee wanted to look further into that. So.
Well, yeah, I guess what I'm taking away from the study is that on surface, some of the recommendations that we think might be appropriate may have more difficulty. And I guess what I would like to know is what you would do to overcome those difficulties. Is there a way to overcome them? And there's three in particular that we talked about here. One was vegetation. The other was, well, actually, there's probably half a dozen of them. The second was barriers, and you're saying that line of sight barriers are not allowed by the FAA. The third, you sort of allude to types of aircraft. Are there differences in aircraft that might make a difference? And I'm get the implication that because we tested three types that there is none, but I guess I'd like to know that better, and including what technology is being used by aircraft that might address this issue. So I'm just sort of laying out questions that came up to me as I read the report and
Sure.
trying to wreck my comments from a year ago. I'm also interested, there's a couple other items that you allude to, now I'm losing my thought on them. Oh, man-made objects. I'd like to understand exactly what impact man-made objects have and what control we have over that. And then Ann had raised, and looking at my notes, I noticed Ann had raised a comment that the direction of R1, I think, had changed 450 feet or something. Ann, I think you said something. Is there
I believe, I can't remember if it was R1 or R2 moved 450 feet closer to our communities. The other moved 250 feet closer.
Yeah. So I guess the construction, alignment, direction of the runways, what impact does that have on ground-based noise? And there may not be any, but I'd like to know that because there has been a change since the 70s to now, and I'm not sure all that noise is caused just by increased volume or caused by next gen or anything else from a ground-based perspective. So I had a question around that. I'm trying to recollect my thoughts from a year ago, frankly. But I guess my broader comment was in our is the airport's response, which I really appreciate them responding. I think our conclusions ought to concur with the surface response, but also address the fact that there may be ways to get around that surface answer, like vegetation, if there are ways to get around it.
Yeah, and this is always been a difficult nut to crack, so to speak, because the sound does emanate at about 45 degrees from the back of the airplane, both directions, and you need barriers either close to the source or close to the receiver. Vegetative barriers aren't the most effective. Concrete walls or things like that are much more effective in doing that. But both of them, you still run into the same obstacles of the height restrictions under FAA guidelines, which usually requires the barriers to be not on the airport because of where the aircraft are operating, which means you move them out into the communities. And then the barriers are also only effective about 1 or 2 rows of houses. And so you could just see that it's a tough nut to crack here of how do you actually mitigate and reduce noise from these ground-based noise sources.
Yeah. Can I make one more comment, Madam Chair?
Please, of course.
As I look at the study, what I'm trying to get out of it are what options does the airport have to mitigate ground-based noise, and what tools or options do the cities have to mitigate it? So if you broke it in those 2 categories and we go through the options, what are the tools that we have to play with? And our study gives us information, but also should yield to what might be specific recommendations. So if I'm reading this, I'm trying to figure out if I was going to make a set of recommendations out of this to mitigate noise, what would they be? And that's what I'm struggling with. It's easy to identify the problem. I shouldn't say easy, but we do a really good job of identifying the problem. We're struggling with what might be some solutions either for the towns to adopt or for the airport or aircraft or FAA to adopt. And that's what I'm trying to get to. What might those recommendations be and what are the pros and cons of them?
Well, and for ground-based noise, recommendations are usually, we talked about it, a barrier. And then there are other ways of operationally, what can you do? Can you move the noise source on the airport to some other location that may not provide the same noise levels in the communities? And so one of the things we looked at in the report too was to, move the aircraft further away from the community or further down the runway in order to depart. Not all aircraft could do that. They're called intersection departures, where you actually depart further down the runway. And so there are things like that you can do in terms of other noise sources. There's ground engine run-ups, and where do those occur? Could those occur in different places or different times of day, that sort of thing. And so operational is usually more effective actually than barriers are trying to mitigate the noise. It's trying to figure out ways of operating differently at the airport in order to provide some benefit.
It gets my point, I guess. I think ultimately we need to take all the information, try to figure out what additional information we need, but come up with some recommendations and then debate the pros and cons of them. For example, you mentioned moving the airport departure. That's an option ought to be considered. We ought to consider, again, this nighttime hush, the nighttime prohibition is an option. There's pros and cons to it, but it ought to be put on the table. What are some of those tools that we then need to get to discuss the feasibility of, and who would be responsible for implementing? That's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be part of the work plan. I mean, we're not going to solve this today, and we can, but we do need to have those discussions and figure out, what alternatives are available to us. What tools do we have in the toolbox to try to then address this? The purpose of the study was to basically show how the noise does propagate out into the community. As you said, define the problem.
Yeah.
And then now it's about, okay, vegetation isn't all that effective, but what other means do we have available to us? And that's part of the next steps at this point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Al. I'm now a councilwoman again. I think you have also become a councilman again. It's that time of year where we rotate around. Thank you for those comments. I'm going to add a couple more, then I'm going to open it up to the public. When I read, and I added, and Angela added, a report that, thank you, Darlene Yapley, sent to me. It was a study done by SFO and Gbn. I might have that wrong. I don't have this, well, I do have it in front of me. Done in January, or released January 2020, that also talked about meteorology. And at that time, they used 1999 data and 1999 meteorology to come up with some, yes, wow, the sound does move up the hill. And maybe one of our outcomes is we need better meteorological data that actually reflects this area, SFO. So adding that to the future work plan or future action. And the other thing that was in that report that San Francisco produced in 2020 was, golly, I just lost mine. The issue about which airplanes were used. I'll have to go back and catch that. So in terms of work plan, I've taken a note of everything Al has. Because we're in this staffing area right now, I don't know the county's plans to replace Michelle. I believe Ms. Stockdale, you're subbing for us as our person, but and I don't know when ground-based noise is next going to meet. I'm sure we will report out at our February full roundtable. That meeting every 6 months is not conducive to moving anything forward. So I hope that we will move more forward on that. If there are other members of any panelists that have anything else that we should add as follow-up from the GBN study, could you please raise your hand or speak up so that we get that list going? I'm just looking for hands right now. I see one panelist's hands. Kathleen, Ms. Wentworth.
You want me to go, or do you want to continue?
No, please go ahead.
I'm really pleased to hear that we're talking about operational issues here, because I think that's a missed point of emphasis that we should address. I have one question, Jean. I'm looking at page 82 of your original report, and I don't know if what you're looking at is something different. Can you reference that? Or maybe you recall it. It's an illustration that shows the takeoff on one left and one right, with two airplanes on it, slightly staggered. and shows the effect of the backblast on the neighboring communities.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, what is that stagger based on? It doesn't look like they're a quarter mile apart.
The
Longitudinally.
stagger, I believe, is due to where they actually start their departure on each of those runways. They are not aligned perfectly. They have a little stagger to them.
Okay, so this does not represent the typical quarter mile departure stagger, what we call stagger between the flights, whereas they take off runway 1 left, they wait till they're a certain point down the runway, and then they release 1 right.
It does not. What it reflects is 2 aircraft basically starting at the same time. We know that doesn't happen, but that's what is being reflected in that model.
So do we have an illustration for what really happens when you have dual takeoffs, which is that one takes off first in a given time, about a quarter mile, when they get about a quarter mile down the runway, then the 1 right takes off?
Yeah, we do not have that. We'd have to calculate about how far that other aircraft is at that point in order to do that.
I would recommend that we get a model of what actually happens in real life, which is just what I described, is my recollection. And that the other part of that is if there's a way to determine using that modeling, that is the actual stagger, if the impact to the surrounding community is additive because of the 2 numbers, or if it's exponentially greater than that, if that makes sense. In other words, 1 airplane plus 1 airplane noise may not equal exactly 2 airplane noise. It may be less, it may be more, I don't know. But I think it would be important to know that. And the reason I think it would be important is that, in referencing Mayor Royce's or Council Member Royce's comments, we may want to advocate for nighttime departures being slightly modified. I don't know what that would look like. I'm just thinking it's something to look at. And one of the ways to modify it might be to have a single departure during certain hours of the night, single runway departure. If it turns out that the 2 departure dual runways use of 1 left and 1 right is more than simply additive, it's going to be a complex discussion, but I think we need the data to know how to go ahead on that.
Thank you, Ms. Wentworth. I am trying to go back to, and Linda is on the call, but for both of us and Al, it's going back over 2 years to the assumptions we were trying to test with the spectral analysis. And I thought we were trying to measure planes leaving at different times on runway 1, but maybe the way it came out, and I'd have to go back and look at the original scope of work, was we added what happens with runway 28 departures, and the drawings or diagrams of that showed that most of Millbrae, sorry, Burlingame and Hillsborough, but if Millbrae is blue, then likely Burlingame and Hillsborough are going to be down in that 60, 65 decibel on the 28 departure. So to me, that means, now I know the airlines sometimes, I guess, get to choose which runway they want, but perhaps at night, a 28 departure with a sharp right turn, so they're not using gap departure, would alleviate nighttime backblast noise. So Kathleen, thank you so much for that. It's just hard to go back when we've had such gaps in talking about this. So I think that's excellent point, excellent addition. Anything else? Let me open it up to attendees. I know we're past our 20-minute mark, but I think we're making some headway here. 3 attendees now. Mark Schultz. Go ahead, Mark. Mr. Schultz.
Thank you. By the way, the Weiler report did cover the noise effects of dual departures. And of course, my phone just started ringing. Just a second. Anyway, some of you may have read my thoughts in the HMMH study that I sent out shortly after it was released. I hope you were able to read it, but I have some further thoughts. First, the model used, SoundPlane, is a commercial version of the Nord 2000 model, which attempts to model noise over mixed surfaces. As a recent National Academies report explains, this is very hard to do, and the accuracy of this model should be understood as limited. Second, The model is A-weighted, which prioritizes higher frequencies where the predominant noise from departures, particularly at a distance, is low frequency. I presume the model does not support low frequency C-weighting, but I do wonder if it could not have been run in a way to mask the higher frequencies. In other words, to show only the effects of lower frequencies. Third, the data from field monitors is quite interesting and shows a larger impact of low frequency departure noise, even though it is also weighted. I think there was an assumption that this data would be correlated with or used in the model, but it was not. Fourth, the departure noise propagation signature used in the model is significantly different from signatures derived from actual monitoring tests at SFO by Wiley Labs, BBN, and most recently, National Academies. The latter found 2 noise peaks, with the louder of the two measured at a distance being not from the closer threshold, but further away at rotation as the plane lifts off. This is an important phenomenon in SFO and should have been addressed. That said, many of these issues are central to what the next version of the FAA's AEDT model will or will not do. Moreover, because if SFO was one of the 3 airports the National Academies used to test the accuracy of the upcoming version of AEDT, I do think there's an opportunity to influence it. I'll put more about this in a paper, which again, I hope you will read. Lastly, I also think this body should be looking into active noise cancellation, including filing for grants to build prototypes, which in discussions with former colleagues at BBN and DARPA are in the realm of technical feasibility for reducing low frequency noise effects. Thank you.
Mr. Shull, on the noise canceling, is that within a home or at a
Yes.
larger scale?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, within a home. Basically, there's been quite a bit of advancement in the ability to use noise cancellation, spatial noise cancellation, where the microphones are directed as a point in space. And this was particularly done by the auto industry to quiet cars. But it's very possible now to build an ability to basically project a sort of a kind of a next gen sound insulation, but it's using kind of some technology to direct noise cancellation to a particular point in space, which would be around your ear. It doesn't do the whole room, but at least it's a start down something that may be useful, over the next 10, 20 years.
Thank you. Or at least trying to sleep. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Shull.
exactly. You could build a bed around it.
Yeah. Ms. Israel. Lynn, I think we just need, there you go.
Yep, I
There,
think,
we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, thank you all. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I feel it's a little frustrating in that, we're 2 years down the line and I'm not sure we're a whole lot smarter. It was sort of mentioned early on that vegetation was unlikely to make a major effect on sound dampening. And that's kind of what your study has now shown. So now we move on to, perhaps more operational items. And that's what we asked from the very beginning from SFO, to enlighten us as to what had changed so that we could look at those factors and determine what might have caused really a suddenly increased noticeable change in sound. So I did put my hand up before Kathleen spoke, and I was laughing because it's exactly what I wanted to say. When do we get to look at like the angle of takeoff, the position on the runway of takeoff, and then those dual takeoffs? Because I do believe the dual takeoffs may have been a newish factor that might have been concurrent with the perceived increase in noise. And I think that that's, a very easy thing. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say easy, but that's something we should definitely take a look at, because that's something that could be changed relatively easily if we understood it better. We need the SFO to be more cooperative, because we've asked for this now for the past 2 years. And I think it's a reasonable thing for our communities to be told. And then one other concern is about the report. I do recall the other issue was that it didn't really show sound propagation up into the hills and the canyons, which is what people are hearing and perceiving. And that concerns me because this data that's being presented by you, HMMH, and I know there's limitations as to what data is available to you to use, but it isn't reflecting the almost amplification of sound up into the neighborhoods far away from the airport that is what is upsetting so many residents.
Thank you. And I know this is slightly unusual to comment, but I looked, and I'm more familiar with Millbrae than I am with the hills of Hillsborough and Burlingame, but I believe that the HMMH study definitely did show increasing noise as the sound moves up the hill. So one example in Millbrae is Central Park, which is sort of in a line, in that 45-degree angle line from runway 1 to City Hall. So when we had our meetings at Millbrae City Hall, we heard that noise, and then up to our park where it would average 76 to 78 degree decibels, which I believe is A-weighted. So Mr. Schill's comment that yes, C-weighted. Now, really interesting, the report that Darlene Yapley sent, which is included in this packet, actually has a great discussion of A-weighted versus C-weighted and finds significant differences in the decibels. Although I have comments when we bring that back to a future meeting and dive into that report, what it means with the variance between A-weighted and C-weighted. But that report that SFO did, or the County of San Francisco did in 2000, really does support my interpretation that noise increases as it goes up in the hills. And as I mentioned to Mayor Royce, when I was up at Crystal Springs Golf Course right across the freeway, the amazing airplane noise you hear so far away from the airport up there. So I think the two reports actually, in this case, support the findings that low frequency noise grows up the hill and gets louder.
Yeah.
That's my take.
And is that the BNN report you're referring to?
Yes. The San Francisco published it January 2020.
Okay. I would like, are we going to discuss that today or at the next
We
meeting?
can't, I didn't get it long enough to put it
Oh.
on the notice of it,
Okay.
but I bring it up now only because it seems to support the findings in the HMMH study. And it has some really interesting information in there about A-weighted, C-weighted. But, you know, Al, I'm still trying to get my head back into these issues after 2 years of COVID. And, you know, so it's frustrating, which is why I will announce that the city of Millbrae will be going more like what Brisbane does. And we're going to be holding more Millbrae-based meetings so that we can dive into it and bring our public along, and the other cities are welcome to join us on that. I just got the approval last night from the city manager. So just because this is complicated stuff. Okay, thank you, Al. Darlene Yapley. And welcome, Darlene.
Thank you. I applaud Millbrae having separate meetings because I think more thinking and synthesis really helps move the ball in these roundtable meetings. My first comment is I completely agree with Councilmember Royce. The studies are a means to an end, that they're not the end in themselves. And I think that there is no need to summarize the studies. I think there is a need to say, what did we glean out of that so that we can overcome the myths and figure out what the actions are. And some examples is we need to conclude the vegetation discussion because the data shows, contrary to what we all kind of thought that would help, it's not discernible to the human ear. So we need to put that to bed so that everybody can get up to speed and move forward. The A versus C weighting, I think it's going to be really important to take the monitors that are done and do A weighting and C weighting so you can see the actual comparison and decide how you want to conclude with a recommendation. And that's part of the monitoring. Another example is the vibration and rattle. There were recommendations that HMMH had in slide 8 of their previous presentation. I think, you know, citizens will want to know if they can do stuff that will improve their noise. The operational category is significant. I think this was in the Gbn report, but it talked about that the runway usage, or no, it must have been HMMH, but the runway usage of 28 was far better than the ones. So these operational things really need to be looked at. And I'm just giving you examples that this is what needs to be distilled. And my recommendation is to take what happened at this meeting today, the ideas that were generated, and there should be a chart that says, here are potential mitigations. Here is the audience. Is it the airport, the cities, or residents? What level of impact and noise could be affected? Low, medium, high. Who needs to do it and what's involved? And then the group can discuss the priorities based on seeing all of that information that's netted out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yapley. Excellent suggestion. And yeah, I would love to see the chart. I am going to push back a little bit on vegetation. Millbrae is going through its general plan. We are unique in our size and our location on the peninsula. We are the narrowest point between two freeways, and we have three current train systems and a fourth one coming, and then we have the runways. So, and when I talked to the managed lane project, which is trying to put a toll lane in, or is putting a toll lane down 101, they told me flat out, well, we didn't do any noise mitigation for our expansion of roads, and cars driving faster make more noise than cars driving slower. Less air pollution, but more noise pollution. They did no mitigation. And my gut feeling is that every transportation agency points at another agency and says, oh, they're making the noise, so we don't have to mitigate our noise. So vegetation, and in the managed lane project, they removed vegetation along 101 at Millbrae. It was pretty straggly to begin with, but replaced it with nothing. So to me, vegetation incrementally, and it may not be SFO's problem, but clearly for our higher office holders, this is a Millbrae problem, and then as it moves up the hill, a Burlingame problem. As Burlingame expands residents onto Rollins Road, which has so much been in the paper, those residents are going to be hammered not just by airport, but by 101 traffic. And collectively, all of these things will mitigate, as well as absorb carbon, which the airport is a major source of greenhouse gases. So I'm not ready to take vegetation off the table yet. And there are other studies, at least for road noise, that it can be very effective on mitigating the sound of cars, whether or not you're on rubberized asphalt or not. So, but I love your chart idea, Darlene. And again, I am grateful for the information you keep sending me. Now it's just trying to absorb it. Okay, if there are no further comments from the public, I'm going to bring it back to the panelists. I'm going to try to summarize.
Chair
I heard
Schneider,
somebody.
I'm sorry, if I may, I just want to do a time check. We are running a little, like 25 minutes behind schedule. So just wanted to give a heads up to everyone.
Thank you. So what I hear, and I've taken notes of everything the public and Jean and Councilman Royce and Ms. Wentworth have said. And my question is, I don't know what kind of staffing we have to start creating this chart, but that might be the next step, which Jean, I think would run right into our work plan. So if there are no other comments on this, let's close out this agenda item. I have to switch my computer here and get to the next agenda item. Where is it? And I thank you all. Good conversation. We just need more time. So moving on to agenda item number 3, FAA response to aviation environmental design tool. I believe Kathleen or Mark Scholl mentioned this. So who is speaking on this item?
That would be me as well, Jean, again.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Hey, Jean, what page on the exhibits is that at? There's 450 pages. I was trying to figure out which is which here.
Angela, Doreen, do you know the page number in the packet for that letter?
Just one moment, I'm looking at it.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and summarize the response.
FAA's response is on page 183.
183? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Doreen.
Of course.
So, so the FAA responded to your request to improve the aviation environmental design tool to address annoyance in terms of ground-based noise and sea-weighted noise. And so they responded with saying, you know, as I said earlier in my response, that currently AEDT does not have the ground capabilities, but that the next major release of AEDT, being the 4 series, right now they're on the 3 series, most recent is AEDT 3D, but in the 4 series, which would be released, they're expecting in 2023, so next year some point, that they will have enhancements to the model, including processing land cover data, calculating attenuation due to ground type and terrain, and accounting for man-made structures. So that is on their roadmap for improving the model, and they expect that again to be released in 2023. They also stated that the FAA does intend to conduct a review of its existing noise policies, have selected the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service to help with the policy review framework and facilitate collaborative dialogue between the FAA and stakeholders. And the review will be data-driven and informed by results of the neighborhood environmental survey, where they showed that there is increased annoyance due to aircraft noise from earlier studies. And then the FAA does also intend to review the continued use of day-night average sound level, or DNL, as a primary noise metric, which for California airports is CNEL, as you all know. And they will also explore whether and under what circumstances supplemental or alternate noise metrics are appropriate to inform research and policy considerations. So I think it was actually a relatively good response. I think the things that we are talking about here, while not able to be included in AEDT at this time, may likely be able to be analyzed in the not too distant future.
Jean, is this where I reread the letter last night. Does this have a comment period due by February 25th, 2022? Or am I confusing it with something else the FAA is doing?
That is probably being confused with something else. This does not require a response. This is a response to the Roundtable's letter to the FAA on asking them to improve the capabilities of AEDT and taking into account ground-based noise more readily, as well as including other metrics.
Okay, but this is the letter that did talk about the neighborhood environmental study several times as terms of what they might bring back into the next, maybe not the version that's being released this year, but the next year, correct?
The neighborhood environmental survey, that's separate. That's more of the data-driven review that they're going to be doing in terms of noise policy, not in improvements to the AEDT model. Those are 2 separate things.
Okay, so the way I read that letter, the reason I'm asking is it basically said, thank you, GBN, but you know, we really don't want to change the average of daytime, nighttime. And really right now, if we're to concentrate on one area, it's nighttime. So I think we should follow up with another letter saying, we are talking about real people who cannot sleep at night. I know other people want to be able to enjoy their backyards during the day, but I think we might have better success working on nighttime activities first. And the problem, and I believe the FAA stated this at our last roundtable, the neighborhood environmental study did not include surveying residents who lived behind runways, or perhaps the better way of saying it is within that 45-degree angle from the end of runways. So they're getting people who are more concerned about in-flight, although one of the studies talks about sidelines. So I have to get used to that new term, sideline noise. So I think we need to tell the FAA that really, if that's all they're doing is looking at the outcome of their neighborhood environmental study, but they didn't include neighborhoods like Millbrae, Burlingame, and Hillsborough, then the study is incomplete. And it's not a true reflection of what we are experiencing, and what we are experiencing needs to be in the AEDT. Al, am I on the right track?
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm sorry, I was trying to find the letter itself to review it here, but no, I agree with what you said.
And there's a correction. It's on page 197.
197.
197. Okay, thank you. Such a large packet, it's hard to keep it all straight here.
Well, the letter was, for the public, it was very bureaucratese, basically saying thank you, and maybe we'll listen to you, was how I read the letter. But maybe I'm a lot more cynical, especially when I cannot sleep at night. But it did talk, well, no, those are the studies, that the 50 to 55 degree decibels in the neighborhood study are showing higher levels of annoyance. So that new curve, it does show the new curve. But I read a lot of studies the last 2 days. What else do we need to do, Jean or Linda or Kathleen, on this? I don't want to be quiet anymore. And I am happy to work. Councilman Royce, would you be willing to work on an additional letter to point out some other things we would like the FAA to consider? I think you're saying yes, but you're muted, but it looked like you said yes.
Yes, I am. I'm sorry. I had
Okay.
the printer going on the background there, so I wanted to mute that noise, but yeah.
No worries. Thank you. So Jean, do you think there's anything else we need to do for agenda item 3? I guess I need to open it up to the public. Public, if you have any comments on the FAA letter, I do see one hand raised. That is Mr. Shull. Please go ahead. And I'm taking notes. I think we've got.
I'll be quick. I just got.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, with respect to the 4 series for AEDT, there's a very, unfortunately, long and kind of hard to slog through report by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine on the approach that the FAA proposes to take in terms of what it's going to be able to do. And from my reading of it, and I can summarize this separately in some writing, it's what they've come down to is to focus on incorporating the land cover data, national land cover data, which is vegetation. But because the physics of how sound is absorbed by vegetation versus how sound refracts and reflects off of buildings is completely different. Buildings are considered a terrain issue. And from my understanding is they are not going to incorporate terrain or buildings. It will only be ground cover. And so I think this needs to be explored further, because I believe here it's really hard surfaces that are probably the bigger problem, although while it is also true that soft surfaces like vegetation may be part of a solution. Thanks.
Thank you. And again, in the sets of reports I read was some discussion on topography. And then the 3 airports that were in that study have some hills. I've flown into all of them, but they are not like us with a fairly significant mountain range right next to the airport. Well, I say that as a native Californian, it's a hill compared to the Sierras, but it is hillier than what's at Minneapolis or at Logan Airport. And the 3rd airport was LAX on those other studies on that. So thank you, Mr. Shull.
And if I could, I think it's important to read actually direct from the letter in terms of what improvements or changes to the ADT they expect in series 4.
Okay.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that way it's clear. So the ADT 4 series will offer enhancements to the noise model, including processing land cover data, calculating attenuation due to ground type and terrain, and accounting for man-made structures.
Good, good. Thank you, Jean. Maybe in our letter, we'll say thank you to the FAA for including that and how important it is given our topography on that. I can be slightly magnanimous enough to say thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. Any of our panelists have any questions? Kathleen, if you think about this, Kathleen Wentworth, you are always so good to us in bringing in points of view we need to hear. So please let us know if there's something we should include. Let Al or me know. And Linda, if we can talk offline about staffing, how to get this done with our current staffing situation. Thank you. Okay, moving along from agenda item number 3 to agenda item 4. And that is Airport Commission meeting update. Now, I do get those agendas, but I don't follow their meetings. I don't know who is speaking on this. And this is agenda October 19th, 2021.
And I'm sorry for any confusion, but we understood that the lead on this item was yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. In that case, why don't we table this for the next meeting, because I don't have anything prepared. I do read their minutes, but I do try to follow, just so that everyone knows, I try to follow the current expansion plans that SFO is doing. They were moving forward with their EIR for a large expansion and an addition of Gate H, which would be on the San Bruno side. Then COVID hit, which was a big financial hit for SFO. And I think parts of the work has slowed down. Bert, I'm sure, would know by far more than me, but we'll bring this back the next time. It's more that my reading with the construction of Gate H will move more gates closer to a Millbrae and San Bruno neighborhood, and a school, an elementary school that is shared by both San Bruno and Millbrae children, basically a couple hundred feet from those gates. And if the jets are using their ADPs, that will increase noise and it will increase emissions. So that's the reason for sort of watching, among other things, the next set of airport expansion is really Gate H. And then maybe what we haven't ever talked at this committee is where the run-ups are and when the run-ups are, because during COVID, I can clearly hear the run-ups, which may have been masked by departures when there were more departures, but that's not sure where that agenda item fits.
And if I may add, for under this item, we did include a link to the rules and regulations, specifically to Rule 11, noise abatement regulation. So it seems the topic would be around that.
Thank you. And I appreciate you putting the links of information there. It really helps us try to catch up and get back to this frame of mind. Moving on to number 5.
And real quick,
yes. Sorry, I'm not on that screen, so I can't see hands.
No, I didn't
Go
have
ahead.
a hand. I just thought I would reiterate or clear up. You said ADP, use of aircraft ADP. I think you meant APU, which is
I did mean
auxiliary
APU.
power unit.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
The
auxiliary power unit
Yep.
engines for instrument checks and all of that.
Yeah. Okay.
And to be honest, the only form of ground-based noise that we have been able to reduce by holding the airlines to their contracts of how long they can run their APUs, as opposed to using power from the terminal. So that's one, in my 6 years on Roundtable, the only success of noise reduction. Okay, got to flip back to agenda. This is number 5, discussion of noise metrics discussion. And if staff could present, I did get a comment from the public member that I can read in at that time. Please go ahead.
And I'm sorry for any confusion, but we will assume that noise 5 was also being led by the chair.
Oh, okay. The chair hasn't in the past done that much, but let me see what I can do on there. Review of remote monitoring terminal thresholds. I believe that a lot of this has to do with noise metrics of the A-weighted versus C-weighted. It has to do with, hold on, I'm just trying to catch up here. A-weighted, C-weighted. It has to do with the location of monitors and the fact that the BNN study, it is looking at the monitors currently in Burlingame and Hillsborough, but it dropped out monitor number 8, one of the 2 monitors in Millbrae. So we have an issue with monitor 8. It is or is not in compliance with Title 20, California, Title 21. And then I
Exactly
would
the
say,
case.
and because right now in the director's report, the data that is used is A-weighted, may not be reflecting the experience of low frequency noise. So that's kind of combining A and B, and maybe Jean, to put you on the spot, maybe you can help us with where can we go to get C-weighted noise and situations represented in reports.
Ms. Snyder, just as a point of reference, this report is on page 254 in the packet if anyone is interested. In
What page? I'm sorry.
254.
254, okay.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Please
Yeah,
go
I was
ahead,
going to
Bert.
ask you, Bert. Go.
So with the update of our noise monitoring system, we reviewed our thresholds, our durations, everything that we've been using on our noise monitoring system since actually HMMH helped us do our last round of them. And Jean can back me up on this. We ran into the same issues with Site 8 as we did before, which is we just cannot get it to fall into line for a Title 21 monitor with the requirements of it in reporting thresholds. So we're doing something interesting with it. We're converting it to an ANEEM monitor, which means that it will not have a threshold. And we will be trying to see if we can correlate it better to aircraft noise. Now, that site's in a difficult situation right now with the newer structures around it and the construction we had going on while we were trying to go through see if we could dial it in better. Hopeful with the new system, we might have been able to do that. Unfortunately, we were not. And so we're going to be looking for a new location to see if we can perhaps come up with a endpoint monitor for the area behind the airport there at runways 1 left, 1 right, which may even mean moving it closer and going from there. So the reports you have here, we have phase 1 and phase 2, which we looked at 12 monitors with nearby, in, and along the noise contour from 2019, which was our largest one to recent times. And we were trying to see if we could, 2018 to 2019, those periods, we were looking for monitors that were closest to those contours so that we wouldn't have to go back to the state and request more monitors in the future. And as I mentioned at our December roundtable meeting, we'll be moving over to the ANEEM noise to track matching for our monitors outside of the Title 21 monitor group near the contours.
Thank you, Bert. My brain is saying it hasn't shifted back into this mode to really understand all the nuances. I think what that means is that at least for Title 21, the city of Millbrae would only have one monitor that falls into that requirement?
Well, yes. And as far as the other monitor, we're looking for to see if we can get better noise to track matching. And so far under a NEAM, we're dialing things in better and using human power to go through each and every event and look at them, listen to them. I know my staff and I have been hearing engine starts, things like that, noise monitors nearby. And those are the events we're trying to make sure that the monitors will capture. And whereas in the past, if you had and I believe this is where the confusion comes that you mentioned at the meetings, that they're not recorded. They're just not attributed to an airplane if we didn't have an flight track. So with what we're doing right now, we're trying to attribute aircraft noise to aircraft and to SFO, put it where it belongs.
Thank you. And yes, thank you. That now I will make sure they're recorded but not attributed. That has been the problem with all of us, Millbrae, Burlingame, Hillsborough. We can't attribute our complaint, or the system doesn't attribute a complaint
it
to a
does.
specific flight.
It does. So a complaint given to us regarding aircraft noise is recorded and is attributed as to aircraft noise. Now, totally separate item, correlating an aircraft noise event to an aircraft is the hard part. So when you have a noise event and there is no flight track that the system can readily find to tag it to, it will then say, oh, that's community noise. So that's what we're trying to prevent, is the system giving aircraft noise over to the community.
Okay, I think I'm trying to remember back to the December and then October meetings. I think the general population like that we're moving to a NEAM, that it's going to
Very much.
give us a better thing on there. I think it's just hard to visualize it. Al, I know that Hillsborough has 2 monitors and Burlingame has 2 or 3, but they may not be in the right place. In your San Francisco study from January 2020, it talked a lot about monitor 3B, which is 1171 Hillcrest, which is a road that gets an incredible amount of traffic with people driving up 280 and then cutting down Hillcrest to get to the airport. So my city, as well as some other cities in the county, are very subjected to out-of-towners driving through us, what we call cut-through or pass-through traffic, which then has something to do with the threshold. And I was reading it last night and saying, you know, I really don't understand this. So I wonder for our work plan, Jean, if helping those of us who are not noise professionals understand the measurements and what it means in the real world on that. And my gut is telling me the background noise that we're, even Portola Valley, we'll talk about this. Well, you set Portola Valley at a existing ambient noise at 45 or 55 decibels. So it really has to be noisy to get above that. But I will tell you right now, in my neighborhood, I'm not hearing anything right now. So there are times when we do not have a constant 45 decibel or 55 decibel. So I know this is too complicated and we've only got 9 minutes left. Al, what do you think about adding this to our next meeting, whenever that might be, is to take what Bert just said and try to break it down so we can fully absorb it? You're
If I
muted,
may,
Al.
Madam Chair, recommend Noise 101. We do talk about that during Noise 101.
I've taken that class twice and maybe a refresher would help. But my problem with that is it's A-weighted and I want to see it in a C-weighted environment. I don't want A-weighted environment because I think that's hurting my community.
Yeah.
Al, you're unmuted now. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was muted. No, I agree with that. I think we could dig into it a little bit more. I think Bert sort of explained it pretty well, but it wouldn't hurt to get into it a little bit. So
yeah, and especially not in terms of in-flight noise, in terms of
C-weighted.
low
yeah.
frequency background noise. I know, Bert, that you added it to, I didn't take the noise roundtable last year. Being mayor turns out you're a heck of a lot busier than when you're just a council person.
Yes.
So maybe I'll take it this year when you offer it again, but I would like something very specific to what the close-in communities are feeling. So very specific to what Burlingame is feeling, and Hillsborough and Millbrae. And I would love to bring San Bruno along with this too. And in a discussion with someone from Brisbane, I
I'll tell
do
you
think
what,
if the roundtable does more departure work, meaning up in the air departure, that would, I think, help Brisbane too. But I think they experience some of what we experience.
well, if I may, Madam Chair, we have modified it. The presentation is a bit more inclusive. I've asked HMMH this year if they might be willing to help us out with the noise metric section. We can work together on dialing that one in to express a little bit more of what you want. If Jean and Doreen will agree to help me with that.
Yeah.
I think that would be lovely.
Yeah. By the way, I do think this ties into the discussion with the BBN report that was sent to us. I think there's a connectivity there. So if we're going to talk about the BBN report, the 2000 SFO report, this sort of ties to that too.
I think in addition to just the noise 101, Bert, I think a good presentation of a need, because I do think that that is very helpful to these communities. And I think part of the issue is, you know, that you weren't able to attribute aircraft noise to aircraft noise that was measured, to noise that was measured.
Mhm.
Now you, with a NEAM, you have better opportunity to do that. I know how a NEAM works pretty well, but I wouldn't be able to describe it. And maybe it's something you could even have your provider, you know, provide, or you guys do or something. I just think having something on a NEAM would also be very helpful.
We'll work together on something for the community. I got to tell you, even having our provider initially telling us how it works was, I don't know, you see a flat spot on my forehead.
No, I felt the same way. I had the same.
Yeah, it was
right.
really an interesting go around of trying to understand. But anyway, I won't waste any more of the roundtable's time. But anyway.
Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, I don't want to get into it. I think we're going to talk about the work plan in a minute, but I do think we need to make sure from a prioritization perspective, and Darlene Yapley said it much better than I did, about trying to get a schematic or chart together with what the tools are and walking through each of them and the different parties, whether it's the towns, the airport, the FAA, et cetera, what role they play in that, and trying to get that is a work plan agenda to move forward. I think that's a higher priority, frankly. And I think the second category is additional information needed. This would fall to me under that second category of additional information, additional background work, questions we have. But I really do think we need to move forward with some pros and cons and some recommendations based on what we've already learned over the last 2 or 3 years that we can then move forward on. So that's sort of my thought. So while I support getting more information and more analysis, I don't want it to detract from the higher priority to me, which is what have we learned and what do we want to do with it?
Thank you, Al. I agree. One tiny addition then, Bert, I know you were the one that pointed out to me the new sounds that the Airbus makes and how well that is captured, because it's different. It is higher pitched. It's
Actually,
unique,
it's low
but it's
frequency.
happening much more often now.
Well, there's more of those aircraft operating. It's the Airbus A220s, and originally built by Embraer. But yeah, since it uses a geared turbofan engine, it does make a moan as that power application is introduced. Orca is what some of the websites call it. And
Okay, just in the matter of time then, I'm going to close this agenda item. I don't see any hands raised for the public. To the public, I know there's a great interest in A-weighted, C-weighted, how the monitors pick up, how it reports out. You know, sometimes I think the realtors would hate me if eventually we can convince the FAA that C-weighted noise needs to be used in drawing contours, and we need the contours so that residents or schools that are inside what is getting hit by low frequency noise can get some mitigation, some remediation on that. But I would love to see contours driven based on C-weighted day versus night contours, not 24/7, 365 averages. That would be my goal, if you guys haven't already figured that out. Moving on to the last agenda item then. Did we have a hand
Mayor
raised?
Snyder, yes, we do have 2 hands raised.
Oh,
from members
okay.
of the public. And I also wanted to note for the record that we did get a written comment from Mr. Peter Grace on this item, and it is posted to our website, and it was also distributed to all members of the subcommittee. But I see 2 hands raised from Mr. Peter Grace and Ms. Darlene Yapley.
Great. And, you know, for the public, because I don't know if this Zoom ends automatically at 1:30 and we get turned off. We have been working on the work plan, which is agenda item,
We
the
won't
next
get turned
agenda
off.
item all the way along. So we'll just have to compile it if we run out of time and we get disconnected. Go ahead, Mr. Grace.
Thank you very much. I'd like to speak about what's shown on page 333 of the San Francisco implementation of a NEAM. Thank you very much indeed, Bert, for implementing. The huge change that a NEAM offers is identifying what aircraft, what caused the noise. This is attribution that's been currently addressed before. Currently, the matching is incomplete and appears to be unused. Today, SFO provides metadata for its monitors. This metadata must continue to be available using SFO's new ANEEM method. Why is this important? The ANEEM data shows greater detail about the flight, such as departure, arrival, airport, close approach, etc. We need a fuller understanding of what is actually happening. I would like to make 5 comments about ANEEM that we could not do before. We can now answer, what are the loudest aircraft at each monitor? This opens up the ability to work with the airlines at the granular level. Secondly, what are the departure and arrival airports at each monitor? This is important. Many of the noise events at some monitors are not created by flights that depart or arrive at SFO. Thirdly, we need to put some resources to matching noise complaints on stop jet noise to the ANEEM results. Fourthly, as mentioned earlier, we need to give A-weighted and C-weighted CNL results for each monitor, and particularly those closer to, such as Millbrae's number 8 monitor, and those behind in Burlingame and Hillsborough. Currently, the monitors only report A-weighted, although temporary noise monitor studies for Burlingame have reported C-weighted alone. As a summary, I asked that the roundtable make sure that SFO provides the metadata using ANEEM. This is similar to what they're doing today. Thank you very much. Sorry to cut
Thank you, Mr. Grace, and thank you for your emails, which Angela has posted. And next up, I'm not on that screen.
Ms. Yapley?
I support Peter's comment that the roundtable ensure that the SFO airport continues to provide metadata using the new ANEEM method, similar to what they're already doing today, so the public can continue to receive information on the flights. ANEEM provides more accuracy in terms of the number of events, but in order to make this useful, we need to build this into the director's reports. The director's report should include both A and C weighting for a few cities. You can't do this recording for all the cities. There's too much storage requirements. So I would suggest comparing the 2 metrics based on the data and picking 2 cities like Millbrae near the airport and a city that's further away like Brisbane. I mean, that's just an idea. You need to show the number of events for a range of CNEL levels. Currently, there's only 1 threshold level. To understand noise impacts, we need to use a range of noise levels. It isn't just about the number of noise events, but we need to have a better sense of the levels of noise and what we think about them. Moving to a NEAMS, and thank you for doing that, SFO, increases the accuracy of monitoring, which is step one. But step two, equally important, is that we see the data and understand it and how useful it is for decision-making. And that's why this has to be presented in the director's report, as well as making the metadata available. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yapley. Bert, I'm wondering, and Linda, if the next technical working group, which will meet in February, if this discussion couldn't move to them, because because it's going to work for every entity, arrivals, departures, ground-based, diving into just what Ms. Yapley has said. Keep it on our work plan, on the ground-based noise work plan, but maybe bring it up to that committee again, as opposed to the roundtable where we can't dive into the details, but the working group, we can go into the details. Al, what do you think in terms of process?
I'm sorry, you faded out on me. I didn't hear what you said.
I'm just saying that what Ms. Yapley just said is the metadata, which I hear, but I haven't looked at it all, that maybe the next place, because we don't know when GBN is going to meet again, is we ask for the ANEEM details to go to the technical working group, because it covers both arrivals, departures, and ground-based noise. And that might be the next place to try to bring us along on it.
I'd agree with that. Yep.
Okay, so that would be a recommendation, Angela, Linda, to Ricardo, and or whether or not we are rotating a chair for the full roundtable.
Just to know, I would just like to note that technical working group is meeting next week. So if it is agendized, it might be at a future meeting.
Right. No, I would get that. Plus, I don't know if Bert needs some time to hear what Ms. Yapley said and what Mr. Gray said, and be able to come up with a presentation that takes in those questions.
I would appreciate the time, yes.
Okay, so we're looking at, golly, COVID has changed things. We used to meet working group every other month, Bert, especially when
In the
Next
off
Gen
months of the
first came out.
roundtable.
So we're talking about March then? Probably,
Yeah,
or maybe end of February.
Yeah, in terms of subcommittee timeline, staff has capacity to do 2 subcommittee meetings in between regular meeting months. So we hope to host 2 subcommittees in March. We still need to define which subcommittees those will be, but staff will have capacity for that.
Okay, so something, Bert, if you could plan for that, that would be fantastic. And probably better than waiting for the next ground-based noise meeting is to put it to a different committee. And I think Al and I are both on that committee anyway, so it's kind of like us talking to us, but it has more members too, so you'll be educating more people.
Understood.
On that. Excellent, thank you. Closing this agenda item, then moving on to work plan. What I've heard is take the list, especially the list that Mr. Royce had provided for the next and the chart, identifying what the issues are, what some solutions might be, and what needs more information. Our work plan also would include a noise 101 update, more specific to ground-based noise, low frequency noise. One of the things on today's agenda is just knowing what SFO has currently done to try to mitigate ground-based noise. That could go into the chart on that for our next ground-based noise meeting. What am I will say that, again, that January report that San Francisco did had a nice glossary. One of the things on the GBN to-do list was a glossary specific to ground-based noise issues and situations. And it looks like that January 2020 study has the beginnings of it. I didn't really read through it last night, but maybe a little bit more, expanded out a little bit, but we might actually get to take that off our work plan if we have something for that. And then that leaves us with what could go into a director's report that is specific to ground-based noise. Ms. Yapley gave us a really good idea, but that sounds like it would probably go in the full director's report. assuming ground-based noise has a separate director's report. And we're running out of time. We're at 1:37. Thankfully, we didn't get exited. Anyone on the panelist had things you'd like to see in a ground-based noise similar director's report? I know that's a hard one
No.
because I go to sleep at night trying to figure out.
Not on that, Anne, but before we conclude, I would like to make a plug for at the SFO.
For what? You cut out, Al.
Oh, I'm sorry, nothing with respect to that, but I would, before we close, I do think we need to, at the next SFO roundtable, make a plug for increasing membership to include a couple more of the neighboring towns. They should be represented here because they have input and this does affect them. So, and I know you will do that anyway, but clearly they should be at the table here on this meeting.
Excellent. Would you mind popping me an email for which cities you think?
Sure.
I'm happy to. It just, I think on my trips, when I do drive around trying to listen to noise, if Brisbane wants to be added, happy to. And also just to make sure that this committee operates more like working group where we can have more give and take with the public on that. And we might need a little bit more time. But this is sort of a year's worth all piled into today's meeting. So I thank everyone for a very big packet and a lot of reading and a lot of trying to remember where we were a year ago. And eventually, once we get our ducks in a row, it would be nice to invite the FAA. And on my to-do list, which might be a work plan item, is what other airports around the world are dealing with these same issues so we can find partners out there on that. And I've tried, and I know Miss Yapley, I know it was upsetting for Palo Alto, and I'm grateful for all of you Palo Altans here today. But I know Miss Yapley works on the UC Davis Noise and Emission Symposium. And I hope if there could be just one panel on low frequency, close in airport noise behind the runways, the 45-degree angle, we might be able to find other people in other parts of the world working on it, which would greatly help us, I think, sharing what's learned, lessons, maybe some mitigation none of us have thought of, which would be lovely on that. So with that, if there are no other comments, I think there were a couple, maybe a B and C under the last agenda item. We'll carry that forward to the next meeting. And if any of you have things that you'd like to see in this chart, an area to look at it, something that maybe all the studies out there have a conclusion and an action, meaning some way to reduce noise, or something that needs more study, please send it to me. And I always happy to have another elected official on board. If you want to send it to Al, I don't want to commit him to it, but I will make sure it gets to staff and we figure out how we can start creating that chart. I think that was a fabulous idea. So with that, I thank everyone. If there are no further comments, you will be notified once Millbrae can put together its first meeting on this. Our neighborhoods that are within the study that HMMH did have gone through a traumatic event due to climate change, which thankfully, it wasn't that we weren't looking at our low-lying areas, but we've had several neighborhoods flood. We need to do some significant work on infrastructure all the way around. And I would like to make sure that airport noise mitigations, if there can be incorporated into that work. With that, I would say from this horrible December 23rd experience, flash floods are something new to our area. Please respect water at all times. And if you see standing water, don't drive through it. Please don't. Keep safe, everyone. The outcome from Dr. Morrow today on our COVID is he thinks all of us are going to have it eventually. Omicron, just be very careful, use mask precautions on that. Keep safe, everyone. Happy New Year.